All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be really zeroing in on something super important, the world of pharmaceutical regulation and validation. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. The meds we all rely on, they go through this like crazy, rigorous journey to make sure they're safe and actually do what they're supposed to.
It really is quite a process, yeah.
So today, we're basically diving deep, right, to figure out the key checkpoints and all the validation stuff that makes this whole system work. And we've got sources that span the whole thing from the very first research in a lab to, what happens after a drug's already out there being used.
Yeah.
We're also going to be looking at all the ways manufacturing is checked for quality.
Yeah, that's key. You've got to have these checks and balances at every single stage. It's a life cycle approach, and everything needs to be documented, solid evidence.
Okay, so let's break it down. Let's rewind all the way back to the start.
Yeah.
Before we're even talking about testing in humans, there's this thing called preclinical work. What exactly is going on there?
So this is where it all begins, like square one. It's all about lab studies, what we call in vitro, like maybe seeing how a drug interacts with cells in a dish.
Yeah.
And then you've got animal studies in vivo to see how it actually works in a living organism.
Right, so this is all happening before we even think about giving it to a person.
Exactly. And all of this early research, it gives researchers the first clues about safety and, whether a drug might actually work. It's like the foundation, really. And they take all this data, all this early research, and package it up into an application. It's called an investigational new drug application, or IND, and submit it to regulators like the FDA here in the US or the EMA in Europe. This is a crucial step because it helps prevent drugs that could be harmful from even moving into human trials.
Makes sense. It's like a first filter.
Oh,
Right.
exactly.
Okay, so let's say a drug makes it through that first hurdle, the IND is approved. Then we move into human testing. This is where clinical trials come in. And these trials, they happen in phases, right?
They do. So you've got phase one, which is mainly about safety. They're testing it out on a pretty small group of people. Then phase two, that's where they're really starting to look at, okay, does this drug actually work? And what's the right dose to give people who have a certain condition? And then if those look good, you move on to phase three, and that's where it gets big. They're doing much larger trials, to confirm if it really is effective in a whole bunch of different people. And they're also monitoring for side effects out in the real world.
So it gets more and more complex, more and more people involved as you go.
Right, exactly. And throughout all of this, you have something called Good Clinical Practices, or GCP. It's kind of like the ethical and scientific rulebook that governs how all these trials should be run.
Got it. Okay, so let's fast forward. Let's say the clinical trials, all three phases, show positive results. That's when a company can submit what's called a new drug application, NDA, or maybe a biologic license application, a BLA if it's a biologic drug. What does that whole process actually look like?
Well, imagine this like massive dossier, this huge collection of every single thing about the drug, how it was developed, how it's made, all the data from those preclinical studies and clinical trials, all the quality control measures, even like what they want the packaging label to look like, all of that goes to the regulators.
Wow. So the regulators have their work cut out for them.
Oh, yeah. They go over all of this super meticulously. They often bring in outside experts to weigh in, too. And ultimately, their decision comes down to this. Do the benefits of the drug outweigh any potential risks? And are they confident that the manufacturing processes are good enough to guarantee quality?
That makes sense. Okay, and that brings us to another key term we hear a lot. Good manufacturing practices, or GMP. How important are those?
Oh, GMP is crucial. It's like the bedrock of the whole thing. They're the quality control standards for literally every step of the manufacturing process. And the regulators don't just take a company's word for it. They actually go out and inspect the facilities to make sure those guidelines are being followed to the letter.
So there are real consequences if a company doesn't meet those standards.
Oh, absolutely. They could be prevented from getting their drug approved in the first place. And even if a drug is already on the market, if there are GMP violations, it could be pulled. So, yeah, GMP is not something companies mess around with.
That's good to know. So it sounds like the oversight is pretty serious. Even after a drug is approved and people are taking it, it's not just, okay, we're done here, move on.
Yep, not at all. That's where post-marketing surveillance comes in. We also call it pharmacovigilance. Basically, they keep monitoring the safety of the drug, but now it's out there in the real world being used by a lot more people. If anyone experiences an adverse event, like a bad side effect, that gets reported. And if any serious safety concerns come up, then what they do is put risk management plans, RMPs, into place.
Okay, so that's a really good overview of like the whole regulatory pathway from start to finish. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about validation. What's the big idea behind it?
Well, you can think of validation as like the proof in the pudding. It's about having documented evidence, not just saying, oh, yeah, this works, but actually proving it that every single process, every test, every piece of equipment involved in making a medicine, it all consistently does what it's supposed to and meets preset quality standards.
So it's kind of like having receipts for everything, but in a very scientific, rigorous way.
Exactly, yeah.
And there are different types of validation when we're talking about making drugs.
Yep, there are a few. So you've got process validation, for example. That's all about confirming that your whole manufacturing process, from raw materials all the way to the finished product, consistently churns out a high-quality product that meets all the specs.
Okay, so it's not just looking at one little piece of the puzzle. It's about the whole process, start to finish.
Right. And there are a few ways to do process validation. You can do it prospectively, which means before you even start full-scale production. You can also do it concurrently, like while those initial production runs are happening. And then there's continuous process verification, which is a more modern approach. It's about ongoing monitoring and making sure everything stays on track.
So they're always checking, always tweaking.
Exactly. And traditionally, this whole process, it involves making sure the design of the process makes sense and then qualifying all the equipment. And when we talk about equipment qualification, we're talking about things like installation qualification, making sure it's installed correctly, operational qualification, making sure it operates as intended, and performance qualification, making sure it actually performs the way it should. And then, of course, there's the actual process performance qualification, where you run batches to show the process consistently meets its goals. And of course, all of this is documented with protocols and reports.
So every step of the way, it's documented, it's verified.
You got it.
Makes sense. Okay, and what about testing the actual drug itself? Does that need validation too?
Absolutely. That's where analytical method validation comes in. It's basically making sure that the tests you're using to assess the quality of the drug, to make sure it has the right amount of active ingredient, that it's pure, that it's stable, all of that, that those tests are reliable and give accurate results. You need to demonstrate a few things here, like specificity, which means the test is only measuring what it's supposed to measure, not picking up other stuff. You've got accuracy, making sure the results you get are close to the true value, and precision, proving that you get consistent results every single time you run the test. And again, this is all documented very carefully with, you guessed it, protocols and reports.
So basically, it's like validating the validation.
Pretty much, yeah. You've got to make sure everything is as tight as possible.
Okay, and you mentioned equipment qualification earlier. Can you break that down a little bit more?
Sure. So with equipment qualification, the focus is on showing that the equipment you're using to make the drug is actually suitable for what you're using it for, that it's installed correctly, operates within the right parameters, and that it performs consistently. You can kind of think of it like if you were in a workshop, right? You'd want to make sure all your tools were the right ones for the job, set up properly, and working the way they should. So it's the same concept here, but obviously much more strict.
Right, much higher stakes.
Exactly. And with equipment qualification, you've got those same types as before. Design qualification, does the design meet our needs? Installation qualification, was it installed right? Operational qualification, does it work the way it's supposed to? And performance qualification, is it consistently performing the way we need it to?
Got it. So it sounds like validation isn't just a box you check once and then you're done.
Oh no, it's definitely not a one and done kind of thing. It's a continuous commitment, really. It's about building quality and safety into the entire life cycle of the product, from beginning to end. It's all about protecting the patient.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second. We talked about a lot of moving parts here. From the initial research all the way to a patient actually getting their medicine, there's this incredibly complex web of regulations and all these different layers of validation.
There is, yeah. It can seem overwhelming, but it's all for good reason.
Right. I mean, when you consider how much data is involved and how many steps there are to bring just one drug to market, it really hits home how interconnected science, regulation, and manufacturing really are. It's pretty amazing, honestly.
It is, and it's all ultimately about protecting public health, which makes it all worthwhile.
Absolutely. And that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us as we explored this incredibly important topic.
It was a pleasure.
We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.